Hello, everyone. For the second lecture of the Reconstruction unit, we're going to talk about and focus specifically on the African American experience in the South during this time period. And so there are some negatives and some positives that the African American community experienced as the Civil War ended. Right? But just to kind of give you a general picture of what the South looked like in general, not just for African Americans, but for people. There was a severe economic depression, right? The war caused a lot of property damage, and then values of these properties decreased, right? So the land, which was for a long time the main source of wealth in the South for white people, was no longer as valuable as it once was. The productivity of the land was down, which is what contributed to the value decreasing. On top of that, you have about 20% of the white male population of the South died fighting in the Civil War. That's 1 in 5 men, right? That's a lot of people. And then thousands more on top of that were disabled. And in addition to that, thousands of African men who fought for the Union side, right? They fled their slave owners. They also died during the war as well. So a lot of death and destruction is kind of what categorizes the war. Sorry, categorizes the South following the Civil War. And once this happens, right, the idea of reconstructing, right, bringing new businesses and new life down to the South, right? You have a lot of people from the North who move down. Some for good reasons, others for more selfish reasons, right? But many were part of the Freedmen's Bureau, which we talked about in our previous lecture. And they were these educators and doctors and government officials who came to make sure that the African American community, who had recently been freed in the southern states, were getting the access to things they needed, like schooling and healthcare and so on, right? Really trying to help them get them on their feet. They provided this necessary aid and support for these African Americans. White Southerners, many white Southerners anyway, did not like the Northerners coming down to the South. They viewed them as corrupt people. They called them carpetbaggers, which is a derogatory term for Northerners who were coming down seeking profit, right? So those are wealthy, maybe businessmen who would kind of come up and buy all the land cheaply while they could and then make a profit off of it, or just in other ways taking advantage of the situation. Perhaps worse than these carpetbaggers to loyal white Southerners, I say loyal in quotation marks here, was scalawags, right? And these were white Southerners who, not because of any true sentiment or support of the Republican Party, but because they saw political benefits out of it, would switch from the Democratic to the Republican Party, right? So they weren't true Republicans who wanted better access and rights for the African Americans, but they wanted the political benefits they could get, such as being able to run for office, getting a job in the government, right, that paid well. And so these carpetbaggers and scalawags were two derogatory terms used by white Southerners who had supported the Confederacy. But to get more particular into the African American experience, right? One thing to talk about are the African Americans in politics. They overwhelmingly supported the Republican Party, which is really interesting because if you look at the modern day demographic of African Americans, particularly in the South, they overwhelmingly support the Democratic Party, right? So we'll talk about that later on, but there is a switch in party loyalties as time goes on. But right after the Civil War, the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party that freed the slaves, right? They're the ones that get the overwhelming support of African Americans. As we mentioned in our previous lecture, right? Once these Confederate states rejoin, they have to rejoin by approving a new constitution, having a new government, and so these new governments are overwhelmingly Republican governments because they are the party that opposed the Civil War, right? Opposed the Confederacy, I should say. And so the Republican governments do a lot of things to help the African American community in the South, right? Such as abolishing some property requirements for voting, right? Because even if you got rid of slaves, right? Most African Americans did not own enough land to be considered eligible to vote, so they got rid of those property requirements. They repealed a lot of these discriminatory black codes, which were laws similar to Jim Crow that prevented African Americans from doing certain things. They helped rebuild the states by financing large infrastructure projects, right, and setting up hospitals and schools. Eventually, during the radical phase of Reconstruction, when the radical Republicans, when Congress is in charge of Reconstruction, African Americans actually get elected to political office, right? And that happens at the local, state, and federal level, right? All three levels. The first black man to be elected to the Senate was a man named Hiram Revels from Mississippi, right? And in 1870, in that same year, a black man from South Carolina was the first to be elected to a House of Representatives. A man named P.B.S. Pinchback was also briefly the governor of Louisiana in 1872, right? So you have African Americans who prior to this were largely enslaved, and the freed population that was there had very little rights, now all of a sudden having African Americans in positions of power, which did not sit well with many white Southerners, or white Northerners for that matter. I think this quote just provides a good context for kind of just how new everything was for these African American people in the South. Um, right? They most of them had never even dreamed of being able to vote, let alone fully understanding the power of it, right? And this quote here is kind of encouraging people to give black people time, right? So they can learn how to do this, learn how to be productive members of a democratic society. During this radical phase of Reconstruction, not only did local Republican states decide to start doing things, but also the federal government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, right, which we mentioned on a previous slide. And these things helped abolish those black codes, like I mentioned, and also even made efforts to desegregate parts of society. Right? For example, in 1871, there was a Texas law that integrated public transportation. Right? And so a lot of you guys, if you know anything about the history of African Americans in this country, you might have thought that these things happened in the 1960s, right, with Martin Luther King. However, right, there was a period in history, briefly, but a period in history in the 1870s when a lot of these things that would eventually become law in the 1960s were happening in the 1860s and 70s, right? And so there was this time where things were getting better for African Americans, and then they kind of got worse again before they got better again. Although a lot of these laws were passed, these local laws were passed, but very hard to enforce, or there was very little desire among a lot of people to actually enforce them, right? And so there might be a law in the books, but then if the police don't want to enforce it, it's a lot harder to make it actually happen. But it was at least a step in the right direction. A lot of African Americans at this time, led by people like W.D. Du Bois, right? He comes a little bit later, actually. But people in the community decided that the best way to improve their lot was to focus on building up their own community instead of having complete integration. So there was not necessarily a huge push among African Americans at this time to become fully part of American society, but more than to create their own community with their own businesses, their own government officials, things like that. In addition to some newly found political freedoms that occurred briefly during the period of Reconstruction, you also have a lot of social changes, things that African Americans, particularly former enslaved African Americans, were not allowed to do beforehand. Now they can, right? So, for example, they could start traveling without permission. They did not need to show any pass to let them go. A lot of them tried to reunify their families because, unfortunately, many families had been forced apart when slave owners sold different members of the family to different people. Marriage was actually now legal for African Americans, so instead of just having a religious ceremony or something like that, it was actually a legal experience. They started building their own schools, including historically black colleges like Howard University. They also attempted just for grammar schools and things like that to get the illiteracy rate, which was at 80%. So 80% of African Americans could not read or write prior to Reconstruction. So their goal was to fix that. One of the largest influencers on black culture, though, in the South, even to this day, right, are the formation of the black church communities, particularly Baptist and Methodist churches. Really, and the ministers who lead them really are the leaders of the entire black community. This graph here just shows you kind of the changing in school enrollment, right? So by 1880, the black enrollment at school went from 0%, nearly 0% to over 30%, right? So that's a huge improvement in about, even from 1870, say, to 1880, that's a huge improvement. That's 20%, 25% improvement, roughly, in only 10 years, right? So they're catching up kind of to the white population, which had stayed relatively consistent during this time, which is also relatively low, right? Only at 60% enrollment. Economic changes, right? Once the African Americans are free to move, they're looking for economic opportunity like anyone else. And so a lot of African Americans move into southern cities. Between those 5 years of the end of the Civil War and middle of Reconstruction, the black population in the 10 largest southern cities actually doubles, right? A lot of movement among African Americans in the South. However, most of them do stay on the plantations that they had been formerly enslaved on. The dream and the promise by people like General Sherman during the Civil War was the promise of 40 acres and a mule, right? That these plantations would be divided up and given to former slaves, right, and parcels of 40 acres so they can become their own farmers and support themselves. What really happens is that after the war, many plantation owners sue and win the right back to their property, And so this 40 acres and a dream fades away, and instead you have what becomes known as sharecropping or tenant farming, if you were luckier, right? And so this cycle here on the next page kind of shows you this working out, right? And so most people are too poor to buy their own land or their own materials, and so they are pretty much rented them out from their former slave owners, the plantation owners. And in exchange for giving them the materials to start, the sharecropper or the tenant farmer would then have to give roughly about half of their product back to the owner, right? And with doing this, it's oftentimes they had trouble making ends meet. They had trouble making any profit, and so each year they got into more and more debt with their with their landlords, and then they had to continue paying more and more, a higher percentage of the share every year. Those who were lucky enough to kind of have some capital to start, some money to start, were able to be tenant farmers, where at least they got to keep all their product, and they just gave a cash rent instead, and that allowed them to sell more and make more profit and kind of be slightly better off. But most African Americans, former slaves, I should say, were sharecroppers. And right, despite all the improvements that the African American population experienced, again briefly during the period of Reconstruction, the racism that animated slavery and the many white Southerners' response to it persisted and actually got worse, right? Because once African Americans have freedom and some sort of power, there's an anxiety among many white former supporters of the Confederacy, and so things like the White League and the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, I should say, sorry, form, and they are essentially terrorist organizations that target African Americans, and they would lynch them, right, just hanging people from trees, right, and killing them, burning their churches and buildings, and they stoked enough fear among blacks during elections that they discouraged many blacks from voting, right? And they would assassinate Republican politicians. So this group was meant to terrorize the African American community and prevent them from gaining any opportunities. And as we'll see in the next lecture, right, with the end of Reconstruction, they are largely successful in scaring off African American voters and in getting the North to eventually kind of lose interest in what's going on down in the South.